In 2019, a group of scientists at a university in Shanghai ran an experiment that ended up challenging a lot of what people believed about where the Chinese people came from. They collected DNA samples from more than 11,000 people, spread out across almost every region of China. Then they took those genetic samples and lined them up against the DNA of the world's most famous ancient civilizations. Ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the early cultures of Central America, every major name you would find in a history textbook. And when the results came in, something strange happened. Almost none of them matched, except for one. And once you understand which civilization it was, you start to see why so many assumptions about early Chinese history need to be thrown out. Before we get into who matched, it helps to understand what these scientists were even trying to figure out. Your DNA works a little like a diary that nobody can rewrite. Every generation, small changes build up inside it. Scientists call these changes mutations, and they happen at a fairly steady pace. If you compare the DNA of two groups of people, you can estimate how long ago their ancestors were the same population, just by counting up how many of these small changes have piled up between them. Here's what made Chinese populations stand out. China is enormous. It's roughly the same size as the United States, filled with different climates, different landscapes, and different local cultures. You would expect that kind of geography to produce huge genetic variety. Instead, the opposite showed up. Genetically, Chinese populations are surprisingly uniform, especially compared to other large regions of the world. That kind of pattern usually points to one thing. Everyone came from a shared starting point, a single group that grew fast and spread out rather than many separate groups that slowly merged together over time. So the researchers had a real puzzle in front of them. If almost every person outside of Africa can trace their ancestry back to migrations that happened somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, and those early travelers eventually split apart and settled all across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, then which of those branches actually became the ancestors of modern China? They started, understandably, with Egypt. It's the civilization most people picture first when they hear the words ancient world. Pyramids, pharaohs, a civilization that lasted along the Nile for thousands of years. Scientists pulled genetic material from preserved remains and compared the ancient Egyptian genetic markers to the modern Chinese samples. The overlap was almost non-existent. The lineages didn't line up. Whatever thread connected ancient Egyptians to the rest of the ancient world, it clearly wasn't running toward East Asia. Next up was Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, often called the birthplace of cities, farming, and written language. Researchers tested remains from Sumerian and Babylonian sites. Same story. The genetic lineages were distinct. There was no meaningful sign of shared ancestry between the people of ancient Mesopotamia and the people living in China today. Then came the Indus Valley civilization, which geographically sits much closer to China than Egypt or Mesopotamia ever did. Its great cities thrived in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India thousands of years ago. If any of these ancient societies were going to share a genetic thread with China, this looked like the strongest candidate. The results showed a small amount of overlap, but nowhere near enough to suggest shared ancestry. One lineage that's common in Indus Valley remains showed up in less than 2% of the Chinese samples. That's not the kind of number you'd see if two populations had blended together at some point. It's the kind of number you'd expect from occasional contact through trade, nothing more. Researchers then turned to the early civilizations of the Americas, cultures like the Maya and the Aztec, whose ancestors are believed to have crossed into the continent from Asia by way of an ancient land bridge, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago. Because of that shared origin point, you'd expect at least some genetic echo linking them to Asian populations today. And there was some, but the two groups had drifted apart so much over so many thousands of years that the connection barely registered. One of the lineages that dominates in Native American populations was found in less than 1% of the modern Chinese samples. The split had happened so long ago, and both branches had evolved so independently since that any shared history had mostly faded from the DNA. They kept going. Ancient farming societies in Anatolia, early hunter-gatherer groups from Europe. Every time the story repeated itself, the genetic lineages didn't match. There was no sign of shared ancestry, no thread connecting these societies to the population living across China today. One by one, every famous ancient civilization outside of East Asia was ruled out. Then, the researchers compared the modern samples to genetic material from the Yellow River civilization, and everything changed. The Yellow River civilization took shape roughly 7,000 years ago along the northern plains of what is now China. It's not a civilization most people learn about in school. There are no towering pyramids left behind, no massive stone monuments still standing after thousands of years. The people of the Yellow River built with wood, mud brick, and packed earth, materials that mostly disappeared over the centuries. But what they left behind archaeologically was still remarkable. Excavations at sites in the region have uncovered painted pottery with distinctive designs, some of the earliest known Chinese script carved into bone and shell, and villages built with real planning, circular houses arranged with a clear sense of order. Their farming wasn't a copy of anything happening in the Middle East either. They independently domesticated their own crops, mainly two types of millet, suited to the dry plains where they lived. Structures decay. Pottery breaks. Villages get buried under centuries of sediment. But DNA sticks around far longer than any building ever could. And when scientists compared the genetic markers pulled from Yellow River burial sites to the DNA of people living in China today, the connection was unmistakable. A Y chromosome lineage that's extremely common in modern Chinese men showed up in more than 60% of the ancient Yellow River remains. Maternal lineages passed down through mitochondrial DNA lined up at similarly high rates. This wasn't a loose, distant connection like the ones found with Egypt or Mesopotamia. This was direct genetic continuity. The team didn't stop at broad lineage groups either. They dug into much smaller genetic details, tiny single-letter variations in the DNA that scientists use to measure exactly how much a population has changed over time. Traits tied to things like hair texture, eye shape, skin tone, and even a variant linked to lactose intolerance that's common in East Asia today, all of it lined up closely between the ancient Yellow River samples and modern populations. In other words, it wasn't just a rough family resemblance, it was a fine-grained match. What this meant was significant. Modern Chinese populations weren't distant genetic cousins of the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians. They were the direct descendants of a group of millet farmers who settled along the Yellow River 7,000 years ago and never really left. For a long time, a lot of historians outside China assumed that complex civilizations tended to spread outward from just a handful of starting points, places like the Fertile Crescent, and that other societies eventually picked up ideas like writing, farming, and city building from contact with those original centers. China never fit neatly into that theory. Its writing system doesn't resemble cuneiform or hieroglyphics in any meaningful way. Its early agriculture was built around millet and rice, not wheat and barley. Its philosophy, its governance, its metalwork, none of it looked borrowed. The genetic evidence backs up what archaeologists had already suspected. Chinese civilization grew up on its own, rooted in the Yellow River basin, without importing its foundations from anywhere else. But the story doesn't stop there, because the Yellow River population didn't stay put. Roughly 5,000 years ago, they began pushing outward, especially southward, carrying their farming methods, their language, and their genes along with them. When they reached the Yangtze River basin, they ran into a completely different group of people, rice farmers who had already been cultivating the land there for thousands of years, with their own distinct genetic lineages and their own long, independent history. Sites in that region show sophisticated rice farming, homes built on stilts above water, and detailed jade carving traditions, a culture that had developed entirely apart from the millet farmers up north. What happened when these two populations met wasn't a simple takeover. The DNA shows blending, intermarriage over generations. The northern lineage became dominant across the south, but it never fully erased the original southern population. Instead, you get a gradient. Regions close to the ancestral Yangtze rice farming heartland show noticeably more of that original southern ancestry mixed in, sometimes close to a third of a person's genetic background. Move farther north, and that percentage drops. But even in the far south, the Yellow River lineage still makes up the majority of most people's ancestry, sometimes as much as 3/4, even in areas located well over 1,000 kilometers from where that lineage originally began. A similar pattern shows up to the west, where Yellow River populations eventually expanded into the Tibetan Plateau. There, the genetic story gets even more interesting. Tibetan populations carry a heavy dose of Yellow River ancestry, but they also carry gene variants tied to surviving at extreme altitude, adaptations that help the body process oxygen more efficiently at elevations most people would struggle to breathe at comfortably. Those particular variants are common in Tibetans and almost absent in lowland Chinese populations. That tells us that when the expanding population reached the plateau, they mixed with groups who had already spent thousands of years adapting to life at high altitude, and that mixing gave the combined population traits it never would have developed on its own. By around 3,000 years ago, the basic genetic makeup of the people who would eventually be known as the Han Chinese was largely locked in. A strong Yellow River foundation, blended with varying amounts of southern and western ancestry, depending on the region. And remarkably, that genetic signature has stayed stable ever since. That stability is really the heart of why this research matters so much. When scientists compare modern Chinese DNA against samples from tombs dating back 2,000 years, or even further back to the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago, the genetic profile lines up closely with people living in those same regions today, Different dynasties rose and fell. Wars were fought. Borders shifted again and again. And through all of it, the underlying population barely changed. Compare that to Europe over the same stretch of time. Waves of pastoral groups moved out of the Central Asian steppe into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago. And in some regions, they replaced the majority of the existing male population. Later arrivals, like the Bell Beaker culture in Britain, produced dramatic genetic shifts in just a few centuries. Modern Europeans carry the genetic fingerprints of several very different ancestral waves layered on top of each other. China tells a very different story, one dominant, continuous population that absorbed its neighbors instead of being replaced by them. Even during periods of foreign conquest, like when Mongol forces took control of China for almost 100 years, the lasting genetic impact was small. Researchers can still detect traces of Mongol ancestry in northern Chinese populations today, but it typically comes in at under 2%. Political power changed hands. The underlying population barely moved. So why did China stay so genetically stable, while so much of the rest of the world went through repeated waves of replacement? Part of the answer is geography. The Yellow River Basin sits boxed in by natural barriers on almost every side. Mountains to the west and south, desert to the north, ocean to the east. None of that made China impossible to invade, but it did slow down the kind of large-scale population movement that reshaped Europe so dramatically. Expansion mostly happened along river valleys and farmable lowlands, in a slow, steady, outward push rather than sudden mass migration. Farming played a role too. Dense agricultural populations are simply harder to displace than small, scattered groups. The Yellow River Basin could reportedly support far more people per square kilometer than the grasslands to the north, where nomadic groups lived. When the population imbalance is that lopsided, even a successful military conquest doesn't translate into genetic replacement. The conquerors are usually a small fraction of the total population, and over a few generations, they tend to be absorbed rather than the other way around. Then there's culture. Chinese civilization built a shared writing system and a centralized bureaucratic tradition that outlasted individual dynasties. When outside groups like the Mongols or later the Manchus took control, they didn't erase the existing system, they adapted to it. Ruling elites learned Chinese, studied classical texts, and intermarried with established Chinese families. Within a couple of generations, their distinct identity had mostly dissolved into the broader population. The writing system itself helped hold everything together too. Spoken dialects across China can be different enough that people from opposite ends of the country might not understand each other out loud, yet they could always read the same written characters. That shared literacy created a sense of common identity strong enough to survive constant political change. Put all of that together, geography, farming, and culture, and you get a population that stayed remarkably intact for 7,000 years straight, surviving empires, invasions, famine, and war without ever being genetically overwritten. This research also revealed some interesting regional patterns once scientists broke the data down by province. Populations in the historic Yellow River heartland show the highest concentration of that original ancestry, often in the range of 85 to 90%. Move further south and that number drops as more southern ancestry mixes in. Move west toward the Tibetan Plateau and you start seeing a blend of Yellow River ancestry with highland lineages instead. But in every region tested, the Yellow River signature remained the dominant thread running through the population. What this really tells us is that the idea of a single uniform Chinese ethnicity is more of a cultural framework than a strict genetic reality. It's more accurate to picture it as a spectrum, one dominant ancestral core with different amounts of regional blending layered on top, depending on geography and history. And yet, even with all that regional variation, the overall genetic continuity across China is still stronger than what you'd find across a comparably sized stretch of Europe. This genetic thread doesn't stop at China's modern borders either. Chinese communities that migrated to Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and other parts of the world over the centuries carry the same core ancestry. It's a genetic line running from a group of millet farmers 7,000 years ago all the way to well over 1 billion people alive today. Since this study came out in 2019, other research teams have run their own versions of it, and the results keep pointing to the same conclusion. Modern Chinese populations trace back overwhelmingly to the Yellow River civilization, with only minor genetic input from anywhere else in the ancient world. The bigger takeaway here goes beyond just one region's history. It's proof that complex, sophisticated societies can rise up completely on their own, without borrowing their foundations from some earlier mother civilization. It also shows that under the right conditions, geography, agriculture, and cultural continuity working together, a population really can stay genetically stable for thousands of years, even while empires around it rise, collapse, and rise again. So when researchers lined up Chinese DNA against every major ancient civilization on record, only one produced a real match. not because of some dramatic historical coincidence, but because Chinese civilization grew up right where its people still live today, and somehow managed to hold onto that genetic thread for 7,000 uninterrupted years. That's not just an interesting footnote in a genetics journal, it's a complete rewrite of how we should be thinking about one of the oldest continuous civilizations in human history.